Good morning. This time next week we'll be voting for our candidates for Greater Manchester's Mayor. Today we continue our series of interviews with those candidates and we talk to Melanie Horrocks, who is the Green Party candidate. First of all, Melanie, how do you think that Greater Manchester should recover from the pandemic, and what plan should the region be putting in place?
I think it's really important that we look at a much bigger recovery issue than just coming out of COVID, and that involves tackling the fact that we are in a climate emergency and we have the opportunity to keep some changes that we've put in place over the sort of periods of lockdown and use them to help drive a recovery. So, for example, looking at the areas of sort of city centres and town centres where there's been a move to put cafes and restaurants outdoors and to close down roads, to have access and to bring back that vibrancy to a lot of our high streets. Actually, I think that is something that we should look at. How do we retain that and build on it so that we actually encourage people to come into those areas and to really, generate an interest in them. And that can be things like the makers markets and the food markets and those sorts of things, having those tied in with outdoor and street eating and not have the constant sort of worry of traffic around us would really make a sort of positive boost to just getting the economy going in a positive way with those impacts as considered as well. So I think that's sort of a really key message that I've had about COVID recovery and post-COVID recovery. Okay,
what sort of damage do you think has been done to Manchester?
I think it's the sort of twofold, and we are all sort of very aware of how there have been failings around issues such as furlough and payments, particularly when it comes to people who are self-employed, and how there have been real financial difficulties. We're also aware of just how many companies have let staff go and those issues that are related to that. Job insecurity has been big, across the region, and people have lost jobs. So there has been a lot of financial insecurity that we need to look at, and a lot of missing support, and particularly, I would say, around renters across Greater Manchester. We saw the sort of immediate headlines in lockdown 1 around what was going to happen to mortgages and what help could be given to people living in their own properties that were mortgaged, but none for renters. And we're now coming to the end of the rent amnesty and rent eviction period. And I really genuinely fear that we're going to be seeing what was already a homelessness crisis across the region explode if we don't do something. And I'm very much of the view that rent should be covered within a government furlough type scheme, that rent arrears should be forgiven, and any landlords who are facing financial hardship, because not all landlords are big multi-conglomerate companies. Some are just ordinary people, using that to support their income. They should be able to apply to the government for a furlough-like scheme. But secondly, we've really had a mental health crisis, and mental health has been seen as the poor relation, I think, within healthcare for so long. And there already was the sort of bubblings of a mental health crisis before the pandemic hit. And as that's come in, and as we've experienced sort of social isolation, loneliness, all of those financial worries that I started talking about, really that's grown, and it's been compounded by 10 years of Tory austerity, which has seen a lot of mental health supply and provision being reduced. And no matter what has happened across the region, we have experienced that as a result of that austerity. And I think that's a really big crisis that is still going to come, and particularly within social care and within the NHS. Those people who have been our heroes throughout the pandemic really desperately, I think, need help and support now and moving forward as well.
What could you do as Mayor of Manchester to help those people, but both on the renting side and on the mental health side?
Absolutely. At the moment, there isn't a huge amount that the Mayor has regarding powers with regards to rent. So one of the things that I have adopted and echoed from Sean Berry's campaign in London is to lobby for rent control to come under the devolved powers of the Mayor. And that would enable me as Mayor to do a full review of what's going on with regards to rent in the city, and to put in median base rates for rent, so that actually people are being able to afford the property they lived in. I've also undertaken that I would put Greater Manchester within the Universal Basic Income Trial Zone if elected. And that would just mean that anyone, without any stigma about whether they were working or were in low paid work, would be able to have a decent standard of living, and that would remove some of those financial worries and concerns, particularly around just basics like rent and food and utilities. So that's really important. With regards to mental health, I think it's a twofold issue. The first is the fact that we are already, with a lot of people, so far down the line because there hasn't been support, that actually we need to put that in place. And that involves not just traditional mental health support, but also to look at issues that go hand in hand with mental health problems. So dealing with issues such as alcoholism or drug addiction alongside mental health provision, and actually really tackling those problems in a joined up way. But secondly, to just actually be able to enable people of Greater Manchester to enjoy those things that really help deal with and sort of control mental health, and in a positive way. So one of my big issues is regarding being able to use transport around Greater Manchester in a much more joined up and linked in way to be able to access our green spaces. And
can we come on to that? I'm going to talk about transport in a bit.
Yeah.
Just staying with that point for the moment, though. Do you think you've talked about having more power for controlling rents? Do you think that the settlement should have the devolution settlement should have more powers for the mayor of Greater Manchester? And if so, what new powers?
I just think we need to be able to have a rent control commission that's run through the mayor's office to be able to look at what rent is being charged and what is appropriate. And it is a sort of a long-standing Green Party policy that the rent should be set at a 35% of median income for those areas. So it would differentiate in different areas. City centre may be higher, other parts of the region may be lower, but that is a good base level so that people actually can afford to pay their rent and to do all the other things that actually are very important for their mental health. Go out and see their friends, go and travel to see their mum. That's why I think rent control is so important. And part of lobbying for those powers, hopefully alongside Sian in London, if she was elected, would be to put forward the case regarding rent arrears. And I think that is terrifying as a renter, the thought that you may be just evicted under a no-fault eviction for something that was so outside of our control. We didn't know what was coming with the pandemic. Central government may have done, but we didn't on an individual level. And they didn't know how businesses would react. So I think that's a really key part, is to join those two sort of lobbying positions together so that we actually really do protect renters, both from the effects of the pandemic, but also in the long term. And part of that would be to instigate a region-wide rent freeze so that there's no rent increases while the true position is sort of worked out and put in place, so that, again, people aren't subject to a huge increase in rent before I could do anything to put that, the issues in place.
Do you think the region should have more powers over education?
I think education is a very tricky one to get right. And I say that as the fiancée of a teacher and a special education needs coordinator. I think what is really important is to be able to work with schools to integrate certain levels of intervention with schools. So that can be in, say, provision of counselling and to get people in to deal with the impact that children have had with mental health, but also to work with a lot of the stigma we've got around food banks and how that is interpreted in school. And I think there's an awful lot that we can do by way of educating children without interfering with the national curriculum and provision of formal education to really bring in outside agencies to help children to understand a lot more. And that includes just some basic politics, which is something I've talked to young people about across Greater Manchester. I mean, the ones I've spoken to are fierce and slightly terrifying. They have really got a grip on it. But, to a certain degree, people are disengaged from politics. And if they're disengaged from politics, they're not understanding just how to make impact in important areas. And I think that's something that can be very much put into schools without putting the additional pressure on teachers to provide that, and to support and work with to sort of offer additional support in those areas and education in those areas. So a sort of yes and no answer. I don't think we should be interfering in formal education. In fact, I'd rather that more control went to teachers and those who are fully trained in that. But I think a lot of policy is talked about, well, teachers can do this and teachers can do that. Teachers are on their knees. Teachers have worked so hard throughout this sort of period that we can't just go, and they can do another thing. It's really got to be, how can we work with schools to support this? And, it's things like when kids are talking to me about, what about the stigma of using a food bank and people aren't taking up, free school meals? And those are the conversations that actually someone external could have in a way that a teacher can't. We can really make a difference. So,
okay, we'll come on to transport now because I know you've been itching to get onto it. A simple question: are you in favour of the current mayor's plans for cleaning the air, which brings in charges for next year?
I'm a bit on the fence on this one because I agree with the fact that we need to do something about the air in the city. It's not acceptable and it's poor. I'm not sure that actually what he's proposed is the best way to have gone about it. I think there's a lot of confusion for businesses and a lot of fear for business. I think there's been a real lack of support from central government so that people don't understand what's going on. And that came out, we did the BBC hustings and we had a question from a recovery van driver called John. And he was saying, but I genuinely don't know what I can do or what I need to do to be ready. Well, he needs to know, and it's not acceptable. And it wouldn't be my decision if I were mayor. It's not Andy's, at the moment. That is a central government decision that they haven't explained. So I think until that came in, I would be looking, until we got that guidance and actually could see where the support was needed, we would need to do something else. And that's where a lot of my transport policies are around actually just making a bigger difference without having to go to that cleaners in.
So tell us how we get to that position without having to go to where Andy Burnham wants to go to.
Yeah, I mean, I think at the moment, public transport just doesn't work in Greater Manchester. The phrase I constantly use is the people of Greater Manchester are denied the opportunity to use public transport. And that's something I really stand by. We can't, if I want to go into the city centre and go shopping, with a reasonably young family and four of us, it's like, well, we can't cycle to the tram stop, which would be the easiest way to do it because there's only 5 bike sheds there. I can't take my bike on, I can't do anything. I can't walk there because I can walk there and my partner can walk there, but, my little girl can't walk there and back, particularly after a day out. You then start making those decisions about what you're doing. And going back to John, if you, in the rescue recovery, if you've got lots of cars going into the city centre, you've got more recovery vehicles needing to go into the city centre. Everything that you make, every decision you make around cars going into, and being used, covers the need for a whole load of other associated services to go with them. That brings in petrol to go to the petrol stations. It brings in, all these extra businesses. So my view very much is to look at public transport and really radicalise it. And that would be to radicalise commuting, particularly across the city, because we're seeing, now just people trying to find anywhere to park in the city. I've seen people now, there's an unofficial car park under the Mancunian Way, and I was living in Hume.
Others as well.
Yeah, lots of others. And I said I was living in Hume when we had the last Queen Councillor on Manchester City Council, and sort of, very much in support of the, Hume is not a car park campaign. People will try and get in any way they can by car and park. And that's because there isn't any alternative. And that's why I've sort of proposed being able to put bikes onto trams, bikes onto buses, have bike storage at at those interchanges. There is a lot can be done if we look across to Europe and how that would change. And that would remove an awful lot of cars immediately if we can actually make that happen. And we know it can happen in Greater Manchester because of what happened during COVID and what is still happening as a result. I just quite ordinarily need a new bike. I ordered it last month. It'll come at the end of June. And that's because there are no bikes around. You know, you are down to selling internal organs and all the rest of it to try and get a bike.
Okay. That's
never been a situation that we've been in before as a region or as a country. And that's because we had all of those bike lanes and people were suddenly able to feel safe cycling and getting around. And that's been the consistent feedback that we have that I've had. People want to use those facilities, but they need them to be safe. And those sort of silly little this wide bits of paint on the side of roads that people then think they're meant to be in and you can't be in. And then, they're terrifying. And most people who aren't hardened cyclists won't use them. So that I think is a really big thing. And I think that could, marketed right and balanced correctly, could make a really big difference. And I say balanced correctly because I'm aware of the sort of trial in Estonia where they made public transport free and they really used it because they didn't disincentivize cars. So it's that's sort of where it is. And that's sort of where I don't want to say I would want to put in a congestion charge because Greater Manchester doesn't want a congestion charge, and that's not very much it. But actually, Andy's clean air zone doesn't affect private vehicles. Mm-hmm. And private vehicles are going to be predominantly the ones that are on our roads. So do you see where I'm coming from? I don't want to say I support it. I don't support it because I do support us massively sorting out the air. And I think we have dangerous levels of air pollution across the city region. But I'm not sure he's got it spot on with that. It sounds like a sort of an easy way to try and fix a problem without looking at the bigger picture. But
can I just come back on the car? Because I know if my wife was sat here, she'd be shouting at the screen right now, saying that some people actually do like to use their cars. Is it the Green Party policy, to eventually ban cars?
No, absolutely not. Okay. And that's something that, we acknowledge that there is a place for vehicles. We would, it's about offering viable alternatives. And a lot of the reasons why people don't use those alternatives is they just don't exist. Mm-hmm. So it's all very well that we've got buses running all over the city, but they are at the moment setting their own routes and not necessarily going where anyone needs them to go. So for a lot of things, a lot of times when I sort of think, can I get to where I need to go to on the buses and on the trams? I can't even get a bus to the tram stop.
Okay.
And that's sort of part of my vision is if we can make it work for those sort of short journeys, and there will always be a time, there always is a time, I do it myself, where you just like, I have got to get here and all of the different things I've got to do today means that it's only possible in the car. And I watch some of my colleagues who go on holiday exclusively with bike trailers and all the rest of it. And you think, wow, that's I'm filled with admiration. But there are times where you just do have to jump in the car. There are also a lot of times when people have got a real need to use the car. And so I think it's about getting that balance. But I think when we see that people want to cycle, then that's the really easy answer. And that's sort of come across very much in Paris. They've seen a huge uptake in cycling because they've started putting that infrastructure in. Mm-hmm. And it's looking at those sort of a lot of those short journeys and particularly the commutes. If I got a job in the city centre of Manchester, I wouldn't be able to get easily to the tram to go into the city, but going into the tram is the easiest option to get in and for work. Mm-hmm. So that's why I said if I could have a really good bike parking facility, as you see in Berlin, as you see in Oslo, as you see across sort of Europe, that's an option to either get there and park my bike securely and know it's there when I get back, or I can jump onto the tram with it if I need to cycle at the other end. So if I need to get off at St. Peter's Square but actually go down Oxford Road to go and get to work, I've got the means to do that, and suddenly that becomes a viable option. Okay. So that's really the mind. But no, I'm not going to steal anyone's cars.
I'm assuming that you're supportive of the plans to franchise the bus system.
Yeah, absolutely. As I keep telling Andy, and every time I tell him, he does the same polite laugh, for which I'm very grateful. But this is a long-standing Green Party policy that the buses are under public control. Really glad to see him implementing Green Party policy.
Okay. And what about trains? What will you do about trains?
Trains really do need to be included in this. That is a sort of, there are bigger issues around that than there are around the buses. But really, we've got some really good routes through the city region or by train, and actually they should have the same opportunity. So I think they should come within a sort of pricing system that covers the city, the city region. I also think we should be able to get bikes on them, and that's not just for the commute, but also to get out of the city region and out. As I keep saying to people, we're surrounded by the lakes and the Peak District, and out sort of to Kinder. Why can't we get on a bike and go, on the train with our bikes and go and enjoy them? Why do you have to have a big car and a very expensive bike rack by the time you're talking about taking your family to do that? So that needs to go as well. The train stations also need to be significantly more disability friendly and quicker than the current plans are. Okay,
let's move the subject on, Melanie. How does the region build more houses if it doesn't use the green belt?
In February 2021, there was a review that said with the number of undeveloped brownfield sites across the city region, that would give us the ability to build over half of the required new housing within Greater Manchester under the government targets. So that would be my starting point. The second one very much, which I keep talking about, is I think we need to have a policy with housing of make, do, amend. We need to look at the exponential growth we've had in empty housing across the region and how that can be repurposed. And that could be just in relation to empty and derelict housing, which would address not just the housing need, but also sort of the antisocial and criminal sort of, and activity that goes with those sorts of properties, but also the loss of community in those areas where you've got that. But also it can look at whether or not sort of the new builds are being used properly. And I'm reminded of somewhere in New Mills, I don't know the exact address, but somewhere in New Mills, just outside the city region, they built a whole, did a mill conversion, marketed it as executive flats. No one wanted them. And it was eventually turned into social housing provision, and it's full and it's thriving as a community, and it's amazing. And that, I think, when we're seeing huge developments, are they actually being used in the right way, or can they be repurposed, and what can be used about that? So very much make, do, amend first, then brownfield site, or and the two together, and then we have to look at what the other need is. But I'm not in favour at all of any greenbelt development, and that would be something I would be very strongly opposed to.
Okay, changing the subject again. What do you think has gone wrong with policing in the region?
Well, I can't tell you exactly because I don't have access to the report. And I've said previously, there is only one person who knows exactly what's gone wrong with policing in the area. Okay. So the starting point for me on getting into office would be to actually get my hands on those reports and to see exactly what has gone on. What do you believe have been the issues? I think we see a lot of them on the streets. We're seeing, we still have got problems with police being very heavy-handed with regards to protesters across the city, and that's something I've drawn attention to previously. We know that there's a lack of confidence as a result of some racial inequalities and racial stereotyping that's still being seen across the region. And I know, having been an IPCC senior lawyer, how much that is a key issue for young black men in particular when dealing with the police, is to how frequently they're subject to stop and search, and Greater Manchester is not exempt from that by any means. And I think those are the sorts of issues that we need to be looking at, and rebuilding trust and rebuilding reputation. And I think that is a sort of an ongoing issue, but I don't agree with Laura Evans that a new computer system will solve all of the ills of GMP. I think we need to have a systemic review of what's going on, and that not just from replacing the man at the top, but from the bottom up, looking at what's going on, listening to community groups to see what they are saying and other problems. And I think that's the only way to do it, a full review, not just a sort of what's going on at the top. analysis.
So, in your first 100 days as mayor of Greater Manchester, your first priority will be to get your hands on that report and
My first week. My first week, I'm having that report. Believe me, as a former defence lawyer and, as I said, a senior IPCC lawyer, nothing that the police would do would shock me. I've seen the worst of it, with 6 years at the IPCC. But I also know what can be done to sort these problems out and how issues around building back can be put into place. And so that would be the sort of key ask a message. I've just looked at the time. I've got a hustings that starts at 4.
Right, okay.
So
Can I get in one final question? Rough sleeping. How do we solve the problem?
Rough sleeping. We address the issues that cause people to be sleeping rough in the first place. Rough sleeping isn't necessarily solved by just giving someone a bed, and I know that from working very closely with, in particular, one homeless person. A group of homeless people that I worked with in an individual basis. They were housed 3 or 4 times during the time that I was working with them and supporting them. They couldn't cope because the housing wasn't dealing with the drug issues, the alcohol, the trauma, the mental health problems, and the mental health problems that put them on the street, and also the mental health problems that came from being on the street. So that's why I think we need to really get cohesive working around not just a bed for every night, which is a fantastic issue that came out of the Greater Manchester Citizens Assembly and was put forward by them. It wasn't an Andy issue, it was a GM Citizens Assembly, but to actually then get in the mental health workers, the drug and alcohol treatment, those sorts of support, and really work to understand why someone's on the street and why they don't feel able to put themselves into housing. Okay.
Melanie Horrocks, thank you very much for your time, and we wish you all the best. And maybe we'll speak to you after.
Let's hope so. It was lovely to talk to you. Thank you very much for inviting me. I appreciate it.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Take care. Bye.
Bye.